that they are all linked. If these answers are not correct, then definitely you'll be using the wrong answers to answer the second part. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to another example. So in the recent years, there are more application questions, less regurgitative questions that are seen in the papers. Now, regurgitative questions are questions where they want you to do definitions, like they want you to define what is a redox reaction, outline the experiment. Perhaps 10 years ago, or even 8 to 10 years ago, you may see those kind of questions. Just by memorizing, then throw out the answers, but not anymore for the past 5 years. A very good example will be this blast furnace application. In the blast furnace application, in simple terms, is an application that's used to extract the iron from the iron 3 oxide. Basically, iron 3 oxide is the rust that we see in our daily life. So, what the students need to study, or what has appeared in notes in the textbook, is that they list out all the procedures on how this iron is being extracted. So students are asked to memorize them. But when it comes to the questions, like in this 204 questions, just about 9 years ago, they have this question below that wants you to outline the equation or even outline the procedure. But if you compare this type of blast furnace question to the recent one, which is the 2013 paper, you realize that instead of asking you to outline all the equations, now they give you the equations. Alright? And then they test you on concepts that comes from other chapters other than the blast furnace application. For example, they have given you all these 5 equations. These are what the students should have already memorized before the exam comes. Now the second part, which of this shows a thermal decomposition? Now the thermal decomposition concept is only taught to them in a chapter on matters. Then on the second part, part C, which equation shows a reaction between acidic compound and a base? That is another chapter, which is the acid, bases, and salt. So you can see that just this blast furnace application, they have brought in other topics to test the students. So the students must be able to link up the other topics to the blast furnace application. They cannot just memorize purely on blast furnace application and then forget about the other chapters. Yeah, so this is what we call applications. Alright, so just a quick one. If you look at this part C, so which equation shows a reaction between the acidic compound and the base? Now the students, besides memorizing this equation, they must also know the nature, the acidic and the basic nature of all these compounds in order to answer the part C. So which of this is acidic compound? From here you can see that this silicon dioxide is an acidic compound. And the calcium oxide is a basic compound. Esther, do you remember why? Now, can you just answer why is this a basic compound?
Because calcium and oxygen react to form the ionic compound itself is a base which can be reacted with acid.
Correct.
To form the salt in water.
Yes, it's actually a base because it's a metal oxide. Alright, it's an ionic compound. Yeah, so to encourage you, you're going to be for this, huh? It shows that you actually listen in my class. Alright, so this is a base, alright, and then this is an acidic compound. So they will react and undergo a neutralization reaction. And that is only taught to them in the chapter on the acid, base, and salt, not in the blast furnace application chapter. Yeah, so memorizing does help, but then if you do not know how to apply, you will not be able to see the link, you will not be able to answer the questions correctly. Alright, so that's one of the examples. Okay, and earlier on I've also spoken to some of the parents about this A-level related questions. Now this was the example, the very first A-level related questions that appeared in 2010, and that is a titration curve. Now basically a titration curve is only taught to the students in the A-level year 1 under the chapter called the reaction kinetics and the chemical equilibrium. Alright, so that time when this was being asked in the questions, students are not able to interpret or find information from the graph because they have never seen the graph before. Yeah, so let me just give you a brief introduction. What is this graph? It's a graph that shows the titration, the reaction between the acid and the alkaline. So when the acid and the alkaline reacts, they will have a neutralization reaction taking place. Now, in order to find the endpoint is basically the pH value which the acid and the alkaline will reach to an equilibrium. So to find the endpoint, the student must know that it is actually the midpoint of the vertical part of the graph. So let's take a look at the question further. That's part C and part D. Now they want the students to highlight, give as an answer what is the pH of the sodium hydrogen carbonate. So if you can't read the graph, you can't even get the pH 9. Alright, so let's move back to the graph. So that is the hydrogen, the sodium hydrogen carbonate is referring to this portion here. Alright, and the student must know that it is point pH 9 because that is the midpoint of the first part of the graph. So, you see, I think it's a little faint. This is the midpoint. Remember, we have gone through this during the class, right? Okay, so that midpoint itself is important because that signifies the formation of the sodium hydrogen carbonate. Alright, so the student must know that at this stage, the sodium hydrogen carbonate is formed at this pH 9. Alright, but because the graph wasn't even introduced to them in the daily school practice, definitely it's not possible for them to answer the questions. So thereafter, many schools, they have start to incorporate the titration curve concept to the students to make sure that they know how to read off on the graph. And in fact, for the subsequent years, in the MCQ, such a graph also appears. Yeah, so because of increasing trend, it's very important for the teacher to keep themselves updated. What are the possible questions? You have to keep the students prepared in advance. Alright. Okay, then so these are some of the points that we have highlighted on the titration graph. So in the session, during the pure chemistry session, we have actually covered this. So students, you have to be able to interpret this graph in case if there's any similar question that comes out. If you still do not understand, try and look for me. Alright? Okay, now let's move on. Now this is another example on the A-level related questions as well. That is talking about the thiosulfate compound with the hydrochloric acid. Now basically the thiosulfate compound is only introduced in the A-level syllabus under the chapter called the reaction kinetics. Alright, so it appeared in the 2013 paper. That was last year's paper. Yeah. So why was this being tested is because basically this practical or this experiment is to show how fast the reaction has taken place. It's a rate of reaction experiment. So when we have added the sodium thiosulfate and the hydrochloric acid together, they will have powder, or in chemistry term we call that as precipitate. So how fast the formation of the powder is will signify the rate of the reaction. So you see a cross here, once the powder is formed, the cross will slowly be disappeared because it's being covered by the powder or the precipitate. Alright? Okay, so in the questions, what they are testing on the students is this part. Explain why is it more difficult to see the cross as the reaction progresses. Now, if the student doesn't know that thiosulfate has this tendency to form precipitate when it reacts with the hydrochloric acid, then they wouldn't be able to answer these questions. Now, in fact, this thiosulfate, you will not see that in most of the textbook or the notes. Yeah, because it's not a compound that is being introduced in the O-level. Alright, so if let's say the student knows this beforehand and know the nature of the thiosulfate, then they will be able to see that it's due to the formation of the sulfur. You see the sulfur is a powder, right, as is signified by the state symbols. So it's because of the sulfur that causes the cross to be disappeared, because the sulfur is an insoluble element. It's an insoluble substance that covers the cross. Yeah, so that's another example. Right? Not to scare you off with all this, but we need to be aware so that we'll be able to prepare them before the exam comes. Yeah. Any questions so far? Okay, let's move on. So that's another one. It's another 2013 paper. That was last year paper. So as I've mentioned, that was actually a disproportionation concept. So this disproportionation is only taught to the A-level students in the chapter called the periodicity and the group 7. So in fact, this disproportionation is supposed to be linked up with the chapter on the redox fraction. So in the redox fraction, if we understand what is a reduction, what is an oxidation, then when you see this word disproportionation, you'll be able to handle the questions better. Okay, so do you remember what's disproportionation, Sherilyn? If I'm not wrong, I think your school notes has these keywords as well, right? Okay, now basically the disproportionation is an element, correct, that will be undergoing reduction and oxidation simultaneously at the same time. Yeah, so in fact this question, that was the last year question, it has briefly mentioned over here the definition of disproportionation. But then if the students know this concept beforehand, at least they can handle the questions easily. Yeah, sometimes when we see this kind of questions that appear in exam, it may be quite intimidating for the students, understanding that they're given a time constraint. Yeah, so not to hurt their confidence, it's good to know it beforehand. Right, so we shall move on to the MCQ part. So what are some of the study techniques for the MCQ? MCQ is quite clear-cut, right or wrong. Alright, not like the structured questions, you have to remember the keywords, the key points, sometimes it can be quite subjective as well. Alright, so MCQ is actually a test on the understanding of the students on the concept, so you need to understand the chapter first. Okay, now if you do not understand the chapters, clarify before the exam, make sure that you are able to grasp the concept well. Let's take a look at one MCQ question that appeared in last year's paper. That is a Haber process. So, the three of you, have you all learned Haber process? Yes? Not yet. Coming soon, right, Ikai? Don't think so, why? Now, why? I suppose why Ikai has mentioned that is because Haber process is a very short chapter. Some of the schools, they actually allow the students to use it as a self-study chapter.